and hope to the mothers and fathers who are going in there. So I'll pass this sign-up sheet around. There's two different sheets. Feel free to sign up for as many slots on as many days as you like, or as little as you can. Put your name, phone number, email, and if you have any questions, you can reach out to me through the GroupMe or through the Pro-Life at St. Pat's email address, which is also will come to me. So I'll be passing these around while Ryan's giving his talk, and let's get to Ryan. So Ryan Peabody, if you don't know him, is an accountant with the Archdiocese, and from my conversations with him, pretty knowledgeable guy about Catholic teaching. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, and let's give him a warm welcome and round of applause.
All right, well, is this like a good distance? Are we okay? Thank you, Sean, for the introduction. Yeah, so I guess for the subject for tonight's talk, I don't know, I kind of had seen it as maybe like an historical interpretation, shall we say, of like, I guess people, a lot of, especially Protestants, maybe Eastern Orthodox to some degree too, see like Catholics as having a lot of this stuff that we've acquired. And, like, where did this come from? Indulgences, papal infallibility, all this stuff. Like, how did it because our claim, right, is that we have this faith that has been continued and preserved by the church since the apostolic age. And so if it might seem like stuff doesn't track all the way back there very, like, at first glance, try to provide maybe an interpretation of how some of this stuff came to be. So specifically, like with Mary, we have certain teachings that might, at first glance, like, be objected to. I guess a lot of these would maybe be of like two different categories. Some things you might just say are totally absent from the Bible or something, right? And so, like, Mary's assumption as an event is never discussed in the Bible, right? And so there it would be more like, I guess, absence of evidence is not evidence of, or evidence, yeah, is not evidence of absence, excuse me. And that's why we have a teaching authority we don't just believe in Scripture, but there's an oral tradition carried down to our own time. But then probably the bulk of objections more come to like what might be called development of doctrine, right? You find some thing in the Scriptures or the early church about, say, like the fullness of grace of Mary. How could that seems like a stretch or something, someone might say, to equate that with, oh, therefore the Immaculate Conception, as we've defined that. The apostles are given the power to bind and loose sins, therefore indulgences. Like, how did that come to be, right? And so this idea of like development of doctrine probably would be better discussed in its own right as a talk. I certainly can't give like a proper articulation of it, I guess, tonight. And there's, I guess, different theories of how doctrine develops. But I guess the common analogy is like a seed grows into a tree, right? And things that were implicit in teachings in earlier centuries are then made explicit in later centuries. And there are different interpretations of how these developments might be legitimate, how one proposed development might not be legitimate. That's not really what we'd go into today. I guess sort of the John Henry Newman's articulation of his idea of doctrinal development is probably kind of the go-to source people reference for this stuff. Other articulations have been condemned as well at different times. Okay, and so I guess when this like pondering on what might be implicit at one time being made explicit at other times, when that happens, like, I should also make clear that we're saying that this comes from like the deposit of faith, right? What was delivered to the church in its apostolic age, going up to the death of the last apostle. And so none of these reflections for like the most authoritative church teachings on Mary, which would be dogmas or dogmata, private revelations are entirely like excluded from the, like, you can't incorporate them as the data, as it were, to talk about a dogmatic formulation. You could say, like, historically, sure, maybe the revelations to, like, St. Catherine Labouré might have provided, like, an impetus, part of the impetus to define the Immaculate Conception. That well may be true, but you couldn't say that, however edifying a private revelation might be, no, like, later miracles or private revelations could be invoked as, like, part of the argument for a, like, most definitive church teaching on something, if that makes sense. Because that would imply that the church went all this time without something that was somehow essential to the faith. And so I guess, yeah, with that, I thought this kind of idea of the development of doctrine with Mary was nicely summed up by this quote from Father Matthias Schieben, the dogmatic doctrine regarding the mother of the Redeemer, so far as it is expressed in the definitions of the Church, may be regarded as the explanation and development of the words of the Apostles' Creed, born of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary. Ray, you say this creed every time you say a rosary, right? And eventually you're gonna ask questions, right? Like, what does it mean for Mary to be the son of, or the mother of Jesus? But then if Jesus is God, is Mary God? Is Mary the mother of God, right? So one question will sort of lead to the next, and you'll be drawing out maybe things that were implicit in the beginning. And yeah, so I'll start. Father Hyacinth had spoken about scriptural Mary in the Scriptures several weeks back and did a great job, so I don't want to rehash too much, but I figured as kind of a launching point into patristic commentaries, I would just go back to that Genesis 3:15. Oh, and actually, sorry, I should pause for a second to just say I wasn't going to do, like, talk about the four dogmas in, like, a kind of apologetics way where I bring them up one by one, and I more kind of wanted to make a story, I guess. I don't know, there's plenty of stuff online if you just want, like, answers or whatever, Catholic answers type stuff. And so I don't know if I won't have time to do the Assumption. I made sure of that as I was thinking things through. And then I think, so the four dogmas that have been defined, which will be kind of our guideposts, I guess, are the divine maternity, or Mary's title as Theotokos, Mother of God, the perpetual virginity of Mary, Mary's Immaculate Conception, and the Assumption. So like I said, I don't think I'm going to have time I won't have time to touch the Assumption, and I'll probably just very briefly touch on the perpetual virginity. So anyhow, without further ado, sorry, that quote from Genesis 3:15, right? We have, and so this is after the fall, right? God is speaking to the serpent, saying, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." And this is sort of the proto-evangelium. It's calling forth the redemption that is to come for fallen humanity. And Father had talked about this, but just to sort of touch a couple things, there's maybe a couple of doctrinal points we can discuss with this. First, to go sort of out of order, would be, in the first clause there, we're talking about that the virginal birth, that Christ will be born of a virgin. So she'll put enmity between the woman, who is, as we had discussed the other week, referring to Mary, and her seed. And so this is sort of a strange thing. Elsewhere in the Scriptures, you'll see his seed. It's a man's seed referred to. And so why is it being, in the order of, like, natural generation, you would have the man's seed being referred to, but this is not a natural generation. This is supernatural birth being referred to, and so it's Mary's seed and shared with the Holy Ghost, conceiving of Christ. And so, as St. Serapian's writing in the bishop in the 4th century, "The woman does not have seed, only man does. How then was that said of the woman? Is it not evident that there is here question of Christ, whom the Holy Virgin brought forth without seed? So we have the virgin birth being discussed, and that really, I don't think historically was much of the virgin birth to distinguish from Mary's perpetual virginity. The virgin birth wasn't too problematic. There's a small sect called the Ebionites in the 3rd century who rejected it, and then I guess in the past few centuries there are I guess kind of critics who deny the supernatural altogether would naturally deny the virgin birth, but that's, I think, usually held pretty, most Protestant groups share the belief in the virgin birth. This would have been expected by 1st century Jews, that if a Messiah were to come, I guess this would be how it would happen. So we have the virginal birth, and then this connection between Eve and Mary also in that statement. And so that, I think, the earliest sources I can find discussing Mary in like the patristic commentaries, this is like the first thing that they're sort of honing in on, that Mary is the new Eve. And so we have from St. Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century, Eve, who was a virgin undefiled, having conceived the word of the serpent, brought forth disobedience and death. But the Virgin Mary received faith and joy when the angel Gabriel announced the good tidings to her, that the Spirit of the Lord would come upon her, and the power of the highest would overshadow her. And then St. Irenaeus, living right around the same time, as Eve was seduced into disobedience to God, so Mary was persuaded into obedience to God. Thus the Virgin Mary became the advocate of the Virgin Eve. So we're drawing this connection between Mary and Eve, that they're alike in some ways, and in our own day we would say that they're alike in both having been created with in an unfallen state. But then they differ in other ways, that Eve fell, that Mary did not. Mary obeyed, Eve disobeyed. And so we draw those parallels, whereas Jesus is also then sort of the new Adam. And so also we're going to have, naturally, if like theology and commentaries and stuff is kind of this more, I guess, intellectual articulation of faith or whatever, it's faith on paper, the liturgy and the life of prayer is faith in action and in prayer, and it's in our desires and how we petition God. So we should likewise start to find Mary cropping up in the life of prayer. And so we do indeed find that. And so whenever we cite like a liturgical text or something and to when it originates, we should first make clear that these things all begin by custom and oral tradition and are then become like formally put on paper, as it were, right? So this here we have the Sub Tuum Praesidium, right? Under thy patronage I fly, O Mother of God, right? Despise not my petitions. This is like a more literal translation. We have here like a little script that was found of it in Coptic that dates back to like I think it's the mid-3rd century. So even though that dates to that time, who knows when these people would have begun praying this prayer, right? I don't know how helpful it is to speculate and put a date on it, but it would have been prior to that time, we can say. And so from the contents of this prayer, right, we can get a couple of good things. We have Mother of God. So this will be the first officially defined dogma, I guess, about Mary in 431. But already, at least 200 years prior to this, we have the people of God referring to Mary as the Mother of God. So it's not like there's this, the Council of Ephesus just draws this formulation up and then like the life of the church proceeds from that. It's like, no, we're at this council, we're clarifying what is already believed by the faithful. And of course the cult of the saints, that they're sending their prayers to Mary. We still pray this prayer today. We send our prayers to Mary and ask for the saints to intercede between God and ourselves. And then only pure, only blessed. It would it would of course be anachronistic to like say that that is the Immaculate Conception in the way that it's defined now, but we find these not only her being blessed, but also pure as sort of in a certain sense only. She has some kind of unique claim on these qualities. And so coming up to the Council of Ephesus, we'll have other fathers also saying lots of, things honoring Mary, and I mean, it's, I guess, hard to, you can only pick so many quotes from people, but I figured a couple good ones that could draw some things out. St. Gregory the Wonder Worker in the 3rd century is, I think it's from a sermon. He's saying, "We, O my friends, resorting to the garden of the Savior, let us praise the Holy Virgin, saying along with the angels in the language of divine grace, rejoice thou and be glad, for from her first shone forth the eternally radiant light that lighteth us with its goodness." And then St. Gregory Nazianzus in the 4th century. So he's here referring to there was some virgin named Justina, a young girl who was struggling with some or another temptation, and he relates that recalling these and other circumstances and imploring the Virgin Mary to bring her assistance, since she too was a virgin and had been in danger, she entrusted herself to the remedy of fasting and sleeping on the ground. And so, in addition to, I guess, the interesting point, which fasting, as a means to obtaining some kind of spiritual end is interesting there. But more importantly, I guess there's a connection between this Virgin Justina and Mary, who was also a virgin, being held by the Church. And what was the other one? Oh, and then the angels are rejoicing in Gregory the Wonder Worker's quote. The angels are rejoicing with us of Mary. So in some sense, there's a recognition that she is above the angels. And then there's a 4th century Coptic anaphora, which is like a Eucharistic prayer referring to her as the Holy and Glorious Mary, Theotokos. So we see that, again, Mother of God, and by her prayers have mercy on us all. And likewise in the Roman Rite with our canon, we have the Communicantes prayer. We don't really know when that prayer started being prayed, and I guess the different prayers in the canon have been like rearranged up till like the 7th century or so at different times. But it was prayed at least, it's hard to say whether it came before or after Ephesus, but it too refers to Mary as Mother of God, and that prayer came from Antioch. So it would have, again, this title would have been widely shared among Christians in the earliest centuries of the Church. I should also note, because in these kinds of histories from Catholics, we're usually focusing on people who are denying Mary a certain privilege or title or whatever. There is one small group called the Collyridians who pop up in the 4th century who did indeed, because I guess, they worshipped Mary as a deity, and so they were condemned by St. Epiphanius in the 4th century. And so I guess that just is maybe to push back a little, like, if there's some idea that the cult of saints was a way to like draw in pagan converts and just try to get more people by like appealing to their sensibilities of having more people to pray to, as it were. There was early condemnation of any idea that Mary could be held on par with the deity. So now over to the Council of Ephesus. So there was, I guess, a lot of these controversies there are different issues at play. So people often remark that like a lot of controversies about Mary are also about Christ, and so this one especially that would seem to be the case. There were a lot of disagreements in the early centuries about exactly the nature of Christ and the Trinity, and there was in the 5th century rather a bishop. Well, he was a monk at the time named Nestorius, who was appointed Bishop of Constantinople. And so he goes out to Constantinople and he brings a presbyter with him named Anastasius of Antioch. And Anastasius begins preaching to the people that, the title of Theotokos, or Mother of God, is not a proper name for Mary. And it's an interesting chapter, I guess, in that the laity kind of take it upon themselves to, and there's the people of Constantinople are kind of like a character in and of themselves throughout church history. That I guess they take it upon themselves to say, whoa, this is not the tradition we have received. And so they petition Nestorius now, who's the bishop, to condemn this priest who's you can imagine probably how insulting that probably was too. They've had centuries now where they're being told that this is a good and honorable thing to do, to petition Mary as Mother of God, and now this man's saying that's casting suspicion on that. And so they petition Nestorius to condemn him, and far from it, Nestorius goes on, preaching sermons in defense, saying that Mary should not be called Theotokos, and Saint Cyril of Alexandria would call his sermons the compendium of all blasphemy. And now, actually, I should say though, I mean, I don't know like any of these languages, so I haven't really done all the homework, of course. I'm no expert. My understanding is in the last 100 or 150 years, more documents have come up that have partially exonerated Nestorius. So we should say there might have been partial misunderstandings, I think. And he was using, so I guess the source of a lot of the controversy was that Nestorius had a different, when he was referring to personhood, he maybe had a slightly different idea than what most of the Orthodox fathers were insisting on as what we should be discussing when we talk about personhood of Christ. So that then brings us to, I guess, so Cyril of Alexandria was very much of the camp employing the terms of person and nature that we now use, I guess. And so he sort of rallied a team to get together an ecumenical council, and it was sort of protracted thing. There were different stages of it, I guess. They condemned him once, but then Rome had to send. I don't recall all the details. But I think the problem with it was something like Nestorius' position was holding that Christ is two persons, and so there's a divine person and a human person, and so Mary is only the mother of the human person, Jesus. And so this was problematic under the idea of person and nature that our formulations use. A person answers the question who, and a nature answers the question what, right? So a nature is has properties that it's what is this thing, a chair? Or what am I, a human, a rational animal? But who am I? So my mother did not give birth to humanity. She gave birth to me, a person who, a person is what does things, right? I eat and I do actions that I can be responsible for and have a certain self-consciousness. And so under this scheme, it was seen as Christ has two natures. He has, fully divine nature and a fully human nature, but he's one person, in which it's not like he's one person with a half human nature and a half divine nature making one person. He's one person, fully human, fully divine. And so therefore since Mary gave birth to a person and not just whatever the whatness of Jesus is, she gave birth to the person that is Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. She likewise gave birth to God, to Jesus Christ, the Logos. So they have a council at Ephesus that ultimately, I guess, defines Mary as Mother of God. So what was already in the life of the church through, I guess the ordinary magisterium, as we might now say, or something like that, is now kind of ratified as the official teaching that you now, you cannot call yourself Catholic and deny this articulation of the faith. And there's like an edifying story of as the people of Ephesus were then like waiting outside in keeping watch vigil at night for these fathers to like come out with the declaration of Marius Theotokos, and they rejoice and they escort them all back to their lodgings. So that's I guess something of a rundown of the Council of Ephesus. So that's again 451. So that then puts us, so we'll naturally expect like once like a definition like that comes up too, you're going to have probably even Mary showing up even more in the life of the church now that this has been like a disputed question, I guess, her status. And then I guess the next controversy I was going to talk a little bit more about at first, but with time, I don't think I'm going to touch it too much, would be Mary's perpetual virginity. And so this is the doctrine that she remained a virgin before, during, and after the birth of Christ. And I guess just for a little context, like if the controversy at Ephesus didn't just come up in a vacuum, right? It was attached to discussions about Christ. I got the impression that the controversy about the perpetual virginity probably had something to do with the rise of the religious life in the 4th century, because the big sort of text would be St. Jerome's response to a certain gentleman named Helvidius. And we don't have Helvidius's writings now, which I think is the case often in these centuries, that frankly, history's written by the winners, as they say, and they don't as well retain the documents. So we only know through what Jerome wrote, but he part of his critique was not just, so he keeps it solely to Scripture in defending the claims of Helvidius that Mary must have had children with Joseph. So he tries to refute it just with Scripture, or at least show that no scriptural passage in and of itself would imply or require that Mary had children with Joseph. And but then the other part of it is his defending the Catholic teaching that celibacy is a higher calling than the married state. And so I would assume that if Helvidius was also attacking this teaching, this idea of Mary's perpetual virginity maybe historically has something to do with kind of the exalted status that the church gives to the religious life. And we've seen in a lot of those Christian denominations today that don't honor Mary's perpetual virginity, they also tend to in time not have they tend to be suspicious of the evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So that's sort of my own take, but I don't know, make of that what you will. So yeah, I'm going to kind of skip over, frankly, most of the kind of meat of this is more like you could find better people to deal with the exegesis online if you want to. I don't mean that to be like, go do this on your own time, but a lot of it's just responding to different spots in the New Testament that admittedly at first glance, like, I'm almost always like, wait, what? The brothers of Jesus, right? And just showing like how that would refer to cousins in his own time very often and stuff like that. So, and I'd even say maybe read Jerome in his own words. He's a pretty punchy polemicist, honestly. It's sort of strange reading him. But so that's sort of that. Oh, well, and I'll say then this was, so that's maybe the origin of the controversy as it exists at least in the West at that time. We have Yeah, plenty of fathers before Jerome had affirmed the perpetual virginity of Mary: Gregory the Wonder Worker, Origen, Athanasius, Ambrose, Augustine, Ephraim, to name just a few. But that's sort of the time when this teaching first comes into debate, and then at the Lateran Council of 649, I guess would be when it. I don't know if that's actually with this one, if we talk of it as like the official dogmatic formulation, the way with the other teachings there's the same, but I would think it is, because so they anathematize anyone who would deny the following quote. So this is basically the teaching of the perpetual virginity, that the Holy Mother of God and ever Virgin and Immaculate Mary, in the earliest of the ages, conceived of the Holy Spirit without seed, namely God the Word himself, specifically and truly, who was born of God the Father before all ages, and that she incorruptibly bore him, her virginity remaining indestructible even after his birth. So that is sort of case closed there, as it were. And so, okay, so I guess from like the time of the Council of Ephesus to, I don't know, the end of the first century, most of the sources we'll find on Mary are like sermons, right? And so as a genre, they might not have quite the kind of like technical nature that you'll find in like, you know, a textbook of theology or something, or like I don't know, in the 13th century, like a scholastic treatise or something like that, where they do all the like question and answer stuff. So there it's going to be hard to like find maybe the clearest formulations if you're like quote mining or something. But it's usually, so it's usually just in a more kind of conversational approach, the way a lot of sermons are dealt. Okay, so then I guess this brings us to trying to give like a narrative to, so in 1854, Pope Pius IX defines this dogma of the Immaculate Conception. And for our purposes right now, we'll say that like what's said in 1854 is basically whatever this thing, original sin, is, Mary never had it at any point in her life, okay? And so I'll try to track kind of the history of how we maybe came to that being taught as de fide, or, you know, a dogmatic teaching, part of the deposit of faith given to the apostles. So in, maybe for this history, I'd like maybe divide it into 4 different stages. I don't know. I thought of it as like first there's the life of prayer, the liturgy, and then there's kind of a more technical debate going on in the sort of high Middle Ages, and then we could say this teaching over time becomes incorporated into like the ordinary magisterium, or I guess, I don't know, it's present in the liturgy, the catechisms, the, you know, writings of saints and pretty much most theologians in later centuries. And then, so ultimately the dogma, again, the promulgation of the dogma, it's sometimes, I think the history is misrepresented as like, there's this Franciscan and Dominican debate that's waging for centuries, and then the Pope is like intervening in this debate. And that's not really how it goes. We'll discuss that more. So the dogma is more just like putting like tying up what is this more natural process throughout many centuries. So onto the, well, before discussing the liturgy, I guess, like, again, there's, you know, for like the first 700 years of Christianity, I guess you could pick all kinds of quotes that say nice things about Mary, and nobody's going to talk about the Immaculate Conception in the exact way that we understand this now, and so that's what I want to try to maybe draw out a little bit. But we have a couple interesting quotes that maybe seemed worth like checking out from this period before kind of the Immaculate Conception as such takes shape as like a defined teaching. So from Saint Ephrem, you indeed and your mother are the only ones who are beautiful in every way. For in you there is no so he's sort of speaking to Christ here. You indeed and your mother are the only ones who are beautiful in every way. For in you there is no spot, in your mother no stain. And so there's something here about Christ that Mary shares that nobody else shares, and he's using this word, no spot, no stain, which is often kind of invoked referring to original sin. Again, what exactly original sin is, we'll discuss too, because that sort of undergirds a lot of this discussion. And so if we have differing ideas about what we're talking about, that's going to be tricky as well. So that was St. Ephrem, and then the Lateran Council of 649 calls Mary immaculate. She's called immaculate in plenty of things prior to in the first century of Christianity. She's called immaculate many times, but it's almost never referred like directly tied with her conception. So it's more just in a more general sense, calling her immaculate. And what exactly we might think, say that these theologians were implying by this at that time, still, when they're talking about it, even if it's not explicitly connected to the conception, or it's not explicitly connected usually to the conception at that time. One sort of exception that's almost uncanny that I came across, because again, this is prior to this debate that we'll discuss, comes from a 6th century hymnist, Romanus the Melodist in Byzantium, in the 6th century, and he says, then the tribes of Israel heard, so he's speaking about Anna would be the mother of Mary. He says, then the tribes of Israel, on the date of Mary's conception by Anna, her mother. Then the tribes of Israel heard that Anna had conceived the Immaculate One. Everyone then took part and rejoiced, and Joachim gave a banquet, and great was the merriment in the garden. Okay, and so we have here Mary being referred to as the Immaculate One at the time of her conception, and likewise Romanus the Melodist. This bottom quote is it's from one of his hymns, I believe, and he's saying, by baptism and chrismation, one is made clean from the iniquity in their mother's womb and being born in sin. And so this I just bring up to point out, because I guess later I'll try to discuss, in our own day there's sort of differing discussions about, from the East and the West, about what exactly we mean when we're referring to original sin, when we talk about this prerogative of Mary's, that she was exempt from original sin. And I'll discuss it more later, but this would seem to imply like Romanus is talking about something when he's talking about the stain that is like what we in the West are referring to when we talk about the original sin, and that this thing is then removed through baptism and chrismation. We'll get more to that later. Alrighty, so the Immaculate, the Feast of the Conception. The Immaculate Conception as a phrase is not as, besides that Romanus quote that I found, is not really, you'll have discussions of her as immaculate, and then you have, in the 8th century in Byzantium, I believe, this Feast of the Conception of Mary sprouts up. And so it's a liturgical feast celebrating the date that Mary is conceived by her mother Anna, as that quote was just referring to a minute ago, though that wouldn't have been for the feast day as such. So yeah, it wouldn't have been called the Immaculate Conception at that time. And so it begins in the East, and that's in the 8th century, and then in the 9th century it comes to Sicily, which is sort of a gateway between the two spheres, as it were, at that time. And then in the 10th century goes to Ireland. They begin celebrating this feast. By the 12th century, most of Europe is celebrating this feast of Mary's conception. And Rome actually, I think, took it on later than then. Might have been the 15th century. At any rate, it's popping up and is widely received by the faithful. And this will then create questions. Okay, so there are only two people throughout Christendom whose conceptions are celebrated as liturgical feasts. So the first would be John the Baptist, and it seems to me that what would be worth celebrating about his conception is that it's a miracle, that his mother was barren, his mother Elizabeth was barren, and that she then, found child. And then the second is this feast, and I think next week it's called the forerunning of, or St. John the Forerunner. They celebrate it in the Byzantine rite. And then the other would be Mary, her conception, that this feast is taking shape in the end of the first millennium. And so there's going to be some theological reflection on this. What exactly, if these two people are the only, and I just sort of said that the reasoning as to why maybe St. John's feast would be worth celebrating, but there's going to be questions about what exactly is worth celebrating about Mary's conception, right? So no other saints do we celebrate their conception, because the idea is, it's a very good and happy thing when we were conceived, right? At the natural level, we should of course be glad, and congratulate people. But from the perspective of the church and the liturgy as a supernatural society, as they're viewing things, it's just one more child of wrath born into the world now, right? What is special about this occasion, right? And St. Augustine actually has an interesting sermon he was preaching. So today is St. Cyprian's feast day, and it originally would have been 2 days ago when he was martyred, and then I think the exaltation of the Holy Cross moved it to today. And on the feast day, he's preaching about that St. Cyprian's birthday. His date of martyrdom is his birthday, right? Because that's when he's going back to his Maker. And he specifically says, even if we did know St. Cyprian's birthday, we would not celebrate it as it would not be an occasion for the church worth celebrating, because again, under our understanding of original sin, there's until you're given the waters of baptism, or baptism through other means, there's you have no supernatural life within you, and so why would the church celebrate this thing? Okay, so there's that question, and so indeed, most of the most well-known theologians in these centuries. Well, I'll first maybe point out one exception with a quote. There's this he has very hazy ideas because it's in the earliest stages of it all. His name's Paschasius Radbertus. He's a saint, Saint Paschasius Radbertus. And he's living in the 9th century, and so he's still attaching this more to Mary's birthday than her conception. But he says, if she were not blessed and glorious, her feast of birth would not be celebrated everywhere by all. Yet because it is observed so solemnly, it is established from the authority of the Church that in no ways, at the time when she was born, did she come under transgressions, and neither when she was sanctified in utero, did she contract original sin. And so he's, it's sort of unclear on to where he's talking about the birthday and where he's talking about her date of conception, but he's bringing up this idea that perhaps there was no instant of her life where she had this state of original sin that she was living under. And so that seemed worth pointing out. But by and large, most theologians in the beginning of the second millennium, most of them were very skeptical about this feast day. And like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux he was not trying to allow it to be celebrated, actually, I think it was in Lyon that he was telling them not to allow this feast to occur. I believe Saint Bonaventure was against it. And so I guess this brings us to the subject of Saint Thomas Aquinas. And there's what exactly he believed about this controversy, I can't begin to draw out. I don't know exactly myself. That most people will say that he did not. Well, he definitely did not, I guess, affirm it under the terms that we now understand we now speak of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. But there is if you ever check out Father Garrigou Lagrange's book about Mary, he posits that there are 3 stages of his life where he believed that Mary never was under original sin, then he didn't, then at the end he did again. I don't know. Not my place to opine on that. But I guess my point is that maybe the common way people talk about it is just they just say he rejected the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, which seems a bit simplistic. And there's maybe some more texture to it than that. But so as these guys were maybe talking about the problem, it seemed to them that there was a fork in the road and they had to take one of 2 ways. So you could, if it is true, so there's this question floating, do we indeed affirm that Mary never had, again, whatever this thing, original sin is, that she never had it? And if the answer is yes, at no instant in her life did she have it, then the sort of problem is that it would seem that Christ then did not redeem her, right? Because ordinarily we say that our redemption, I guess, is applied to our souls through baptism. And yeah, so there's sort of, it's seen as you can have it one of 2 ways. You can either affirm this privilege to Mary that she was truly immaculate and never had original sin, or you can affirm that Christ is really the Redeemer of all men and women who have ever lived. And yeah, and so I guess most theologians seeing it maybe presented in those terms, and I'm sorry, it can almost sound condescending. I don't mean to sound like they were children or something, and then Duns Scotus rescued them from their ignorance or something. So forgive me if I'm talking about it like that. But yeah, given it being presented that way, most theologians were probably going to opt for Christ's universal redemption as the top thing, I guess. And I think up till this point, I mean, I certainly can't say I've delved into all the history, but I think it's a pretty similar track being followed from the East and the West. There's this feast that the people love, and then there's this theological reflection, lots of people lots of theologians rejecting the idea of an Immaculate Conception, and then some maybe positing that it could be affirmed. And I'd also say, I think some people will bring up on the St. Thomas point that something about him not, or maybe medieval theologians in general, that the reason that they denied, again, that's sort of a weird way to put it, denied the Immaculate Conception, which I don't know if that's the right word to use, was that they had different understandings of when the soul came into existence. And I think that's a red herring, actually. I don't think that really gets to what the debate was about, because even if they believe that like the body existed for some point in time in the womb and then a soul came to be, you'd still have the same problem, it seems to me, that you would still have to discuss, okay, so it's the soul that gets original sin, not the body. So I don't know, fathers, please correct me if you see it otherwise, but I don't really see where that reading of the history there, like I don't see that as being the point of controversy, really, that's relevant from how we understand this dispute. So, let's see. Okay, so then about a lifetime after St. Thomas, yeah, there's Blessed John Duns Scotus, who was a Franciscan theologian, and so this problem of either Mary is all pure, preserved from original sin from the first instant of her life, just the way Eve originally was, right? And so that's another reason in favor, in addition to all these, words of her purity and her being immaculate, of course, throughout church history. Another sort of reason in favor of this understanding of her conception being free from sin at that time would be that this would seem in some way to be required for her to truly be the new Eve. They would share this trait in common, that they began the race with the fullness of grace, or with sanctifying grace. And then on the other side, as it was seen, that they would need a redeemer, or she would need a redeemer to be freed from sin. So Duns Scotus then puts out this solution of preventative grace, and so his thought is that perhaps we can have both of these things be true, and if for the rest of us it is indeed true that we're born with original sin, and then Christ, I forget what the word, we'll say curative grace. We are cured from original sin by baptism through the merits of Christ's sacrifice. Perhaps it could be that Mary was still redeemed, but through a different way that was unique to her, that would make her able to fulfill this role as God's mother and the new Eve, that would seem to require that she be pure, free of original sin. And I should also mention it, nobody in these debates would have had any disagreement about Mary never committed a personal sin through her whole life. I think that's taken for granted by all parties involved here. But yeah, so preventative redemption, that this grace, she was prevented from ever contracting original sin, and so in a way this is an even greater redemption than what is made available for the rest of us. Because if you had in the natural level, like if you had a doctor, wouldn't you rather him, instead of curing your wound, wouldn't you rather him give you advice so that you never, get it in the first place? Like it would seem that this is an even better way to save Mary. So she is truly being saved, but she at no one point in her life has this state of original sin that makes her an enemy of God. And all right, so yeah, so this opinion, I guess, will then slowly gain favor over the course of several centuries as sort of, wow, he solved the problem. It's kind of cool. he figured it out. And and so again, I said I wanted to push back against this. There's this like narrative of it being some kind of Franciscan-Dominican rivalry, which my reading of the history seems that's a little bit facile. Like, first off, until Duns Scotus, who was a Franciscan, puts this forth, there was no, again, like I said, most theologians oppose the idea of the Immaculate Conception, as we now speak of it. And it had nothing to do with East or West, Dominican or Franciscan. It just had to do with how the question was put to them at that time. And so naturally you would, in I guess the earliest centuries after Duns Scotus formulates this solution, the people in his circle were going to be probably the most receptive to it. And so I think Franciscans, by and large, were the earliest to hop on this side of the dispute, and perhaps Dominicans might have been a bit more with St. Thomas being such a respected teacher. They were sure to follow his teachings, but there's other instances. So, well, first to go in time. In order of time, we have, so the Council of Trent comes, and so by this time, we see this position of his is starting to be held rather widely, and so when the Council of Trent, when the decree on original sin is promulgated, they explicitly, the Fathers of Trent explicitly put at the end of that decree that Mary is exempt from, they don't positively affirm her as never having contracted original sin. So they're not defining her Immaculate Conception, but they're saying that she whatever we're saying above this about original sin, keep her out of, she's not under consideration right now for this statement. And so I guess I should also mention, I've seen some, sorry. There was some French book I saw cited that hasn't been translated yet, but it was being cited as saying that it was written in the 19th century, but saying that some 10,000 professors of the Dominican order defended Mary's great privilege prior to its definition in 1854. At the Council of Trent, 25 Dominican bishops signed a petition for the definition of the dogma. Thousands of Dominicans, in taking degrees at the University of Paris, solemnly pledged themselves to defend the Immaculate Conception. So it's hardly like there was some intractable debate that was going on through all these centuries that Pius IX then intervened on. It was a much more Duns Scotus solution, seems to solve these problems, and people in due time jumped on board. And and so we have, after the Council of Trent, St. Robert Bellarmine was the first bishop, I believe, or the first theologian to formally petition the Pope to give, I guess outside of the context of a council, give a dogmatic decree about this, what at that time would have been a theological opinion. So that's to say, you would not be at blame or outside of the church or anything for not holding to this at that time, but he wanted it to be made sort of dogmatized for the benefit of the faithful. And then we have more kind of, I guess, at this time you have more of a reading public too, I guess, as people always talk about in Reformation histories. And so you have Counter-Reformation saints beloved by Catholics everywhere. Francis de Sales, Louis de Montfort, St. Alphonsus, they all affirm the Immaculate Conception. And so by 1661, Pope Alexander VII acknowledges that now, quote, now almost all Catholics embrace it, this opinion of the Immaculate Conception. And Spain was particularly influential in sort of promoting the cause of the Immaculate Conception. There's one funny story in 1615. There's like it actually was a Dominican in this case, I must say. He was preaching that he didn't, to a group of nuns, that he didn't believe the teaching of the Immaculate Conception, and the people of Sevilla where it happened got word of it, and they came to try to burn down his priory, and the authorities intervened, so it never happened. But then they shot off fireworks instead as their form of protest, I guess. So it was a funny story. But that's an exception to the thousands and thousands of Dominicans that I've just referred to. So, yeah, so then by 1854, we have this sort of pent-up demand, as it were, to make official this belief that clearly the faithful, the theologians, the catechisms, the liturgy are all teaching by this point, teaching clearly that Mary at no instant of her life had this thing, original sin. And so, yeah, so Pope Pius IX then, I guess, put together a theological commission or whatever, prudence would dictate you should do before, putting together a papal bull, promulgating a dogma. So he puts forth Ineffabilis Deus, it's called. And the crux of the actual, portion of that text that would be the dogma is that, quote, "The Blessed Virgin Mary, at the first instant of her conception, by a singular privilege and grace of the omnipotent God, in virtue of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of mankind, was preserved immaculate from all stain of original sin." So we have, it's still recognizing that this is all made possible through the merits of Jesus Christ, so it is a true and proper redemption as Christians understand that. But it is also from the first instant of her conception. So at no time, this thing that is fallenness that we share, at no time in her life did she have that state. And so that puts me pretty much to the end. I just maybe want to point out one thing that seems important to discuss as well, though, that and here's another one, I don't know, fathers, if you have any corrections, please, but it seems to be that there's original sin being used in this is kind of a bigger word than it might seem, and so that has created debates. Like a lot of Eastern Orthodox do not accept this definition, and so I maybe wanted to touch on some of the differences that are at play here, as I understand that there's we're often told that we refer to, I guess, what's called like an Augustinian understanding of original sin, and that's then meaning that like original sin is some kind of guilt that is passed down. I don't know what the relevant texts are of Augustine that this is being taken from, but the idea of the charge is that original sin is being referred to as some kind of guilt that is being passed down from one generation to the next through Adam, and that isn't really the essence of original sin as it exists, as I understand it. And so in that understanding, they would then say, like, we're not personally guilty for Adam's sin. So this whole idea, as we're defining it, of original sin is kind of on shaky foundation from the start. But it seems to me that the essence of original sin is rather a privation of grace. So it's not a thing in and of itself, like original sin. The essence of it, there's a lot of like effects and consequences of it and punishments. But the essence of it, we should insist on that it is a privation of grace. And so some of this language of like a stain can sometimes be misleading in that it could give one the impression that it's actually like the genetic material you inherit from your parents or whatever, that original sin, something like that it's a guilt that somehow passes down, but it's really rather an absence of whatever that quality that the first parents had that made them children of God. People call it sanctifying grace, original holiness, original justice. Whatever that quality was, we lose that. Original sin is the state of not having that, basically. And so to say that Mary did not have original sin is really to say that she did have the fullness of grace, the sanctifying grace. And I think that's helpful too. It maybe puts things less on just this one instant of her time that's her conception, and we get maybe a nice broader look at things, that it's not just her immaculate conception, right? It's her immaculate existence. She lived her whole life. She was from start to finish. She ran the race, and she never fell. And she is truly the gem of all of God's creation. Oh, and so. Yeah, and so I thought, sort of to give, some more authority to my idea of, as I just put it out, is a definition of original sin given by a certain Father Louis Biot. Original sin is the privation of original justice insofar as original sin depends on the voluntary act of Adam, source and principle of the human race. Right, so it depends on the voluntary act of Adam, and so it flows from that as a from that action, we've now all been deprived of this, but it's not saying that the main thing is that we are, what original sin actually is a guilt that has passed down. It's rather a privation of justice that has passed down. And so, like I said, that seemed for the best not to talk about the Assumption, so sorry if I maybe, ramble or whatever, but I hope that was maybe somewhat helpful, giving more of a history rather than kind of apologist's take on all these subjects. But I think that's about it, and if anyone has questions, I'll see what I can do, but I don't know.
Thank you, Ryan. I know these talks take a lot of work, and we're all working or going to school, and we appreciate all the time you put into that. I know it's hard to consolidate. If anyone else feels called to give a talk, we're always looking for speakers. I know it can seem a little bit intimidating, but I've given one talk myself, and it's very good for the speaker because you're doing the research and you're thinking it through over a week or two. Or in my case, 2 days. If you're interested, we'd be happy to find a slot for you, something that suits you and your interests. Just a few announcements. So next week, we're going to have Father Dominic. I don't know if he's still here. He's going to be speaking next week and finishing out our series on Our Lady this month. He's going to be talking about Our Lady, her influence in his life and his conversion. So that should be a good one. And then that'll close out the series. And the last Thursday of each month is our social night. So this week, our coordinators are going to do a tailgate theme because of football. I have no idea who's playing, but someone's playing that night. And they're going to and everyone can just wear your favorite jersey for your favorite team. Doesn't even need to be a football jersey per se, but that should be fun. And then next Tuesday, we have a volleyball team. We have 2 volleyball teams, and we're playing against each other. So if anyone wants to come and watch or sub, we're going to be going out before. It's called the Green Room, a bar around 6:30 in Fairmount. If anyone wants to come, you're welcome to join us. And then next month, we're going to be doing Catholic social teaching. So that should be an interesting one. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you next week.